introduce your speaker. Dr. Gleb was named the Office Whisperer by the New York Times for helping leaders overcome frustrations with hybrid work and generative AI. He serves as the CEO of the Future of Work consultancy, Disaster Avoidance Experts. Dr. Gleb wrote 7 best-selling books. His most recent role is titled Chat GPT for Thought Leaders and Content Creators, Unlocking the Potential of Generative AI for Innovative and Effective Content Creation. The one before that is called Returning to the Office and Leading Hybrid and Remote Teams. He published over 650 articles in prominent venues such as Harvard Business Review, Forbes, and Fortune. His cutting-edge thought leadership was translated into Chinese, German, Russian, Korean, Polish, Spanish, Vietnamese, French, and other languages. Dr. Gleb's expertise comes from over 20 years of consulting and training. His clients include Fortune 500 companies ranging from Aflac to Xerox. His expertise also comes from his academic background as a behavioral scientist. Dr. Gleb taught for 8 years as a lecturer at UNC Chapel Hill and 7 years as a professor at The Ohio State University. Dr. Gleb is a proud Ukrainian American and lives in Columbus, Ohio. In his free time, he spends abundant quality time with his wife to avoid his personal life turning into a disaster. To help you take advantage of his groundbreaking expertise, I've asked him to share with us about unconscious bias. Now, please give a big round of applause to welcome Dr. Gleb.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you for that kind introduction.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so welcome, everyone, and I am proud and happy to speak at the first event. That's awesome. Congratulations. So we'll talk about how to defeat unconscious bias using emotional and social intelligence, and we'll define all these terms as we go. But just to give you an idea of what we'll be going through. So first, we'll be talking about some specific examples of how we make decisions that are problematic. So we're talking about unconscious bias that has to do with making bad decisions about other people, biased decisions. Now, these are unconscious biases. We're not going to be talking about overt discrimination or anything like that. We're going to be talking about the way we unintentionally make bad decisions without others not realizing that we are making these decisions that are not based on actual facts that should cause us to evaluate others positively or negatively. So we'll be talking about some examples of the way we make these bad decisions first, and then we'll talk about some ways of addressing these problems. All right. Now, whenever I give a speech, whenever somebody meets me, they see me, I look like a normal white mainstream American male, and they start wondering when I speak, hey, this is not a normal white mainstream American male. They often ask me where I am from. Where are you from? That's a common question I get. And as was mentioned, my background is in Eastern Europe. So my dad is Ukrainian, my mom is Moldovan, and that's where I come from. Now, Ukraine, unfortunately, is too well known, its geographic location now. Moldova is a much smaller country to the southwest of Ukraine. It's so small that you need an arrow on the map to point to it. So that's where I come from. That's my background. I came to the United States when I was 10, in 1991. I was born in 81. In 1991, when Ukraine, Moldova were freed from Russian domination, my family, with me, and my little brother came to the United States, to New York City. So that's where I grew up. Now, New York City is a very multicultural, diverse place. And you walk a block, you hear a dozen different accents. So I didn't really feel pressured to give up my accent. That was something that was just a part of me. And my parents taught me to be proud of my cultural heritage. Now, if I moved to a place like Columbus, Ohio, where I live right now, that's much less diverse. So I probably would have worked to give up my accent, but that's not where I lived. And I was happy that my parents left, especially in 1996, when there was a World Values Survey that showed that of all the countries in the world, Moldova was the least happy. I have no idea why. I was 10 when I left, but I was glad that I left. Still, my parents taught me to be proud of my cultural heritage, so I kept my accent. I found out later that was kind of a dumb decision because of something called accent discrimination. So accent discrimination, that's a tendency to perceive those with accents different from yours, different from mainstream American accents, as being less trustworthy and disliking them. Now, there's only one foreign accent to which this doesn't apply. Can anyone guess what that is? British. Yes, they still have that cultural imperialism going for them. And so this has to do with that accent discrimination with two cognitive biases. So cognitive biases are the specific ways that our brains are miswired. When we talk about unconscious bias, that's a broader category. When we talk about cognitive biases, those are the specific ways we make bad decisions about other people. And so here are two cognitive biases that you really should be aware of and work to address. They're called the halo effect and the horns effect. The halo effect and the horns effect. So the horns effect has to do with someone wearing little horns. It is a perception that somebody is bad in some way, usually because it's something that's different than yours. Accent, appearance, culture, religion, ability. Something that causes you to perceive them in a negative way. And so that one characteristic will cause you to have a negative experience of all of their other characteristics. And that's the horns effect. And so with my accent, that's an example of many people having a horns effect as a result of that. Now, there are plenty of other examples of the horns effect. So for example, if you look at things like ability, we're obviously here as part of the disability network, that unfortunately also causes people on average to have a horns effect toward those who are perceived as less able. So that's one tendency, but it's also in other areas. So for example, somebody who is a man but shorter than average will be perceived as worse on average, and we have a lot of research showing that folks, men who are shorter than average, will get a lesser salary, less promotion opportunities, and so on, less likely to be hired when compared to people with the same skills but who are not as short. And the same thing goes for women, not in height but in aesthetic appearance. So for women who appear, as judged by external observers, to be lower in aesthetic appearance, they will get less promotion. So that's a tendency called lookism, L-O-O-K-I-S-M. So that's another tendency. So those are examples of horns effects. So that's something for you to really consider. The halo effect is the opposite. It's like someone has a little halo on their head. So our tendency is if we like one characteristic of someone, we tend to have too positive perception of all of their other characteristics. So think about, for example, if you are from a region of the country, let's say you're from the South, and you live, let's say you move to a place like New York City, and then you meet somebody else from the South and you have a similar Southern accent, you'll tend to have too positive view of that person. And this applies to all sorts of characteristics. So that's the halo effect. So we tend to have too positive view of people. Again, going on our examples I already gave, people who are men and tall. If you look at the CEOs of the top Fortune 500 companies, you'll find overwhelmingly that they are over 6 feet, usually over 6'1" or 6'2", something like that. Much, much higher than the average men who are 5.8 feet. Again, there's no reason why you have to be an extra 4 inches taller and be the CEO of a Fortune 500 company, but that's just what it is. The same thing for lookism. So you women who are perceived as better than the average on external observers will tend to be promoted faster, will tend to have higher salaries. So that's the halo effect. Those are some examples. Now, when we think about this, these are, of course, especially dangerous for hiring and promotion. And when we think about hiring and promotion, that's really big. So thinking about ability, disability, thinking about bias, really consider the horns effect and the halo effect when you're hiring and promoting people, when you're evaluating people in general. Those are pretty dangerous tendencies. Now, of course, you also have that between departments within an organization. So for example, you can have a tendency of having horns effects between production and sales, because sales tends to overpromise, and then production's like, well, why are you overpromising something that we can't deliver? So you can have horns effects within an organization between different departments. That also functions. So keeping that in mind, it also takes place between different groups of people. Now, thinking about various horns effects and halo effects tendencies, you've probably seen this slide before in the training, the Abbott training on bias, discrimination. And so I want you to pause and reflect on all of these tendencies. You've probably seen this wheel before, and all of these tendencies can be quite problematic when you have perspectives on things like ethnicity, ability, gender, sexuality, and origin, accent. All of these can be causes for the horns effect and the halo effect. So these are quite challenging things. So you really need to be aware of what's happening, and this wheel provides you with some good categories of thinking about areas where the horns effect or the halo effect might be at play. So I want you to take just 10 seconds and reflect for yourself. Which of the areas on the wheel might be most powerful for you, might be most impactful for you? All right. Now, I'll talk about an area that's not represented on the wheel, but can be surprisingly powerful. And this comes from a presentation. I'll show you a video in a bit. That comes from a presentation I did, much like this one, but for a larger group. It was the Central Ohio, where I live in Columbus, Ohio, at the HRACO, which is the SHRM group, Society for Human Resource Management group, annual conference on diversity, equity, and inclusion. This was the closing keynote of the conference, and there's over 100 people in the room from companies that are prominent, well-known, companies like Nationwide, companies like Battelle, and so on. So HR leaders who are interested and passionate about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And what I'm going to do is I will ask them whether they will hire a Michigan fan. Now, if you know anything about Columbus, Ohio, you know it's the home of the Ohio State Buckeyes. And we have a huge rivalry with the University of Michigan Wolverines. They suck this year. That's true, I'm not joking. I actually met someone, a Michigan fan, who acknowledged that they suck this year. And their only hope is beating us at the end of the season. That's what they're hoping for. They already lost 3 games. We've been pretty good this year. So I will ask them whether they will hire a University of Michigan fan. And this is like the bigger than the Suns Lakers rivalry. It's a huge rivalry. So in that context, let's see what they say. Again, over 100 people, closing keynote of the conference.
So, as you know, I'm professor at Ohio State. I'm contractually obligated to root for the Buckeyes. I'm guessing there are a lot of Buckeyes fans here now. Go Bucks, right? Oh, yeah, there you go. Now, how likely are you to hire a Michigan fan? See, 3 people. Now, regardless of how we feel about Michigan fans and their poor choices in which team to root for, does that indicate anything about their performance as an employee? No, I know. Come on, that no should be stronger.
Now, being a sports fan is not one of the categories on the wheel, as you can imagine, but you can see how powerful it is. That's over 100 people in the room, only 3 would hire a University of Michigan fan. And it wasn't only an initial impulse. I gave them a chance to change their mind, and they really weren't interested in changing their mind. So if we think about issues that are more divisive, that are more contentious than sports fandom, how powerful do you think that would be in terms of the halo effect and the horns effect? That's something you really want to be thinking about. Again, over 100 people in the room, diversity, equity, and inclusion conference, closing keynote. This should not have happened. So here, what we want to be thinking about in order to address these problems, or what's going on more broadly, is emotional intelligence and social intelligence. So addressing emotional intelligence and social intelligence is going to be key for you. Now, emotional intelligence, you've probably heard these terms before, has to do with awareness of your emotions and ability to manage your emotions. How aware are you of how you feel about other people? Consciously and unconsciously. We can learn to sense, to feel when we have negative thoughts about other people that are undeserved. And we can learn to manage those thoughts. So that's emotional intelligence, awareness and management. Now, social intelligence has to do with more relationships to others. When you are aware of how other people relate to others and to yourself, as leaders, that's something. So emotional intelligence, of course, is important for leaders and not rank and file alike. Social intelligence is especially important for leaders because you have to be aware of your relationships to others and their relationships with each other, and then being able to influence these relationships. Relationships between you and them, and the relationships between everyone else. So those are the key areas that you want to be thinking about in addressing cognitive biases and addressing the ways that we make bad decisions around other people. Emotional intelligence and social intelligence. That's the broader framework to think about. Now, what's going on here? Why do we make bad decisions about other people? Really what we need to understand is that our minds, how we think, are not really wired for the modern world. That's not what they're wired for. They're wired for the ancestral environment. When we lived in small groups of 50 people to 150 people, that's what our intuitions are about. That's how we feel. And so the halo effect, the horns effect, other cognitive biases we'll talk about have to do with their origins in the evolutionary environment. So the ancestors survived due to the fight or flight response and tribalism. So what's the fight or flight response? You might have heard of this as the saber-toothed tiger response, where it was more valuable, more important for us to jump at 100 shadows than to miss one saber-toothed tiger. We are the descendants of those who jumped at 100 shadows and didn't miss the one saber-toothed tiger. So that's the fight or flight response. Causes us to make judgments way too quickly, to jump to conclusions without considering the evidence sufficiently. Tribalism, so that's one dynamic, the fight or flight response. Tribalism is, of course, the fact that we lived in small tribes and we had to be loyal to our tribal members. If we weren't sufficiently loyal to our tribal members, then they'd kick us out and we'd die. Also, if we weren't sufficiently hostile to other tribes, then those tribes would take us over and we'd die as well. And you notice we're the descendants of those who didn't die, whether with the fight or flight response or the tribalism. We have evolved these things. We have them just as part of who we are. Now, with emotional intelligence, we can notice them. We can notice the fight or flight response. We can notice an intuition to jump to conclusions without considering evidence sufficiently. We can also notice the tribalism, the tendency to evaluate those who we perceive to be in our tribe more positively, more powerfully as good, and to tend to be hostile, negative to those who are in other tribes. So that's something for us to really be thinking about. And here, we need to realize that you're all here from a scientific background. Abbott Labs, obviously, is a scientific company. This is not part of something that's weird or bad. It's just part of human nature. It's part of our biology. It's part of how we think. So it's just part of human nature to have strong tribalism, to have fight or flight response, and these are our gut responses. So gut reactions and intuitions can be quite problematic. We need to be aware of when our gut reactions are leading us astray and make good decisions, because while the gut reactions were great for the savanna environment, it wasn't a problem to be tribalist there. We were living in tribes, and it was important for our survival to have the fight or flight response. In the modern world, you face many less saber-toothed tigers, but you face many more frequent decisions where it pays to take some time to consider other people and evaluate them more accurately. So cognitive biases is the specific term that's used, that scientists use, for the ways that our brain is miswired. You can take a look at the list of cognitive biases on Wikipedia. There's going to be over 200 of them. So you can check those out. Now, I'll also send you, and I'll send Heather an assessment, and she'll forward it to you with 30 of the most common and powerful cognitive biases in professional settings. And I'll talk about the assessment later. So you don't need to look that up. I'll send the 30 ones that you need to be most aware of in an assessment. But the halo effect and the horns effect is going to be especially important for you in evaluating other people. So let's move on to another cognitive bias. So what do you see here? How many people see an older woman? Raise your hand. Great, lower your hand. How many people see a younger woman? Raise your hand. Okay, so think something like 2/5 see a younger woman and 3/5 see an older woman. Great. And now, let's take a look at the picture together. So this is a picture of both a younger woman and an older woman. And you could see the breakdown in any of these slides of what it looks like. So the picture on the left will look more like a younger woman. The picture on the right will look more like an older woman. And so the younger woman, she's looking out in that direction, and the older woman is looking out in that direction. So with these slides, and I'll send you the slides so you can take a closer look at them. I'll send them to Heather, she'll forward it to you. This is a picture of both a younger woman and an older woman. And once you see both, you can flip your sight, how you frame it, to see either a younger woman or an older woman. And the key here that you want to be aware of is that if you tend to see a younger woman first, most people who see the younger woman first tend to be more optimistic. Most people who see the older woman first tend to be more pessimistic. Or if you prefer to call yourself realistic, you can also do that. So, these are two common biases that are missed in conversations about diversity, equity, and inclusion: the optimism bias and the pessimism bias. So an optimism bias is an unrealistically too positive view of reality, and a pessimism bias is the opposite, too negative view of reality. So those, again, are two cognitive biases that you really want to be aware of, and this is something that I know personally because I tend to be strongly optimistic. Now, this is not a binary. This is going to be a range. So you'll have people who are extremely optimistic, strongly optimistic, moderately pessimistic, strongly pessimistic, and extremely pessimistic. So you'll have this range. I tend to be strongly optimistic. Now, what does that mean? That means that I tend to be very entrepreneurial, very creative, innovative, and I tend to also be too risk blind and too likely to chase after shiny new objects. So that's kind of what being strongly optimistic leads to. Now, people who are strongly pessimistic or moderately pessimistic or extremely pessimistic, their tendency is to be fixers, improvers. So they tend to be managers. They keep other people's feet on the ground, but they tend to be too risk averse. So that's the tendency of people who are more pessimistic. And you really need both of them on your team in order to succeed. Because if you don't have enough optimistic people, then you will tend to have fewer ideas than you should have. If you tend to not have enough pessimistic people, you'll tend to just be running all over the place with way too many ideas. Now, as an optimist, I tend to wake up in the morning and I have 20 ideas and they're all brilliant. So it feels to me as an optimist. Now, what I do, so I run a consulting company, Disaster Avoidance Experts. This is consulting and training. It's a 6-people company. I make sure that I don't only hire other optimists. It's very easy for me to hire optimists. I click with them very well. And it's very easy for pessimists to hire pessimists because they click with them well. But I make sure to hire pessimists who I trust. And so I hand my 20 brilliant ideas over to a pessimist who I trust, and she goes over them and she says, well, these are all half-baked potatoes, but maybe these 3 out of 20 are worth finishing baking. And she works on those 3 ideas, she fixes their flaws, and she improves them, and then she's great at implementing them. So that's kind of a great way for optimists and pessimists to work together. But unfortunately, that's not the way that optimists and pessimists tend to work together. What tends to happen is that optimists share a lot of ideas and pessimists tend to shoot them down. There tends to be a lot of team conflict as a result. And that's a problem because it means good ideas don't succeed. Optimists feel frustrated. So that's where a lot of optimists come to work and they feel a lot of frustration that they can't get their ideas implemented. Whereas pessimists come to work and they feel a lot of frustration and they feel a lot of anxiety about optimists shooting from the hip. So they feel a lot of anxiety. That's kind of their state, anxiety and worry about all the things that can go wrong and all these crazy ideas that all of the optimists are coming up with that are just never going to work and kind of changing plans quickly. Not something that pessimists like to see. And so those are the tendencies that I see in companies that cause optimists to perceive pessimists negatively and pessimists to perceive optimists negatively. A much better way of working together is the way that I described working together with optimists generating ideas, but then not feeling attached to the ideas. So the key is for the optimists to generate ideas and then pass them over to pessimists for pessimists to evaluate the ideas. That's a much, much more effective technique. It addresses the frustration of optimists because they don't have to worry that their ideas will be shut down. And it addresses the anxiety of pessimists because they don't have to worry that optimists will be just shooting from the hip and then some weird, kooky ideas might be implemented. That's a much more effective way of working together. So I want you to take 10 seconds and think about where the optimism-pessimism bias might be playing a role in your activities in your team at Abbott Labs. Take 10 seconds and please do that. And so that's why you want to be thinking about how both groups can collaborate by combining their powers together. So you're thinking about all the optimists, all the pessimists. Really think about how, if you're a pessimist or a realist, if you prefer to call yourself that, how you can work together better with optimists. If you're an optimist, how can you work better together with pessimists? So combine each other's powers, don't fight with each other, and evaluate the strengths of each other in a complementary way. All right, so let's talk about how we can deal with these cognitive biases. How can we deal with these dangerous judgment errors? There are going to be 3 keys that I want to talk about, and I want you to think about them. One is to learn about them yourself and watch out for them. So we talked about a couple here. We talked about the halo effect and the horns effect. We talked about the optimism bias and the pessimism bias. And you'll get some more resources to learn and address these cognitive biases more by yourself. Also, integrate then the knowledge into your team and organization. Bring this information from today's presentation and the resources that you'll get, which forward to Heather, she'll forward to you, to help address these problems for yourself and for your team. And finally, implement approaches that I'll talk about to address these dangerous judgment errors. Now, we're thinking about implementing the approaches. The key is to focus on people's emotions, not simply what they think, but what they feel. Just learning about the cognitive biases. Now, you come to this presentation today, you learn about them. It's not going to be enough to fix them. You have to care. You have to think about this. You have to feel that this is important to you. Otherwise, there will be a lack of motivation to address these problems. Because 80 to 90% of our behavior is driven by emotions. You might think of yourself as a rational person, scientific person, obviously Abbott Labs, scientifically oriented company. But no matter how scientific or rational you are, everyone is fundamentally driven by emotions without us necessarily recognizing it. In fact, there have been extensive research on people whose brains have been impacted traumatically so that they don't feel emotions, they can only have rational thought. And you can see that they are very bad at motivations, at making decisions. They can still evaluate things, but they're not motivated to do anything. They just can sit around all day, really complete lack of motivation. So our emotions are what motivate us. That's what moves us. That's what causes us to make decisions. Our values, what we value, that's emotional. And so to address cognitive biases, we need to identify where we tend to fall into these impulses and address what we find out. So recognize the pain, the damage that's caused to you and to others by falling into these cognitive biases. Now, talked about the assessment. So the assessment and dangerous judgment errors. What's that about? So this is an assessment where it looks at the 30 most dangerous judgment errors in the workplace, talked about that, and how to address them. So helps leaders evaluate the impact of these cognitive biases and gives you the next steps to address these problems. So I recognize for you, I recommend that you and your team take the assessment. First, you can take it by yourself, then you can take it with your team to learn about and address these cognitive biases. So let's talk about some examples of questions that you'll find on the assessment. Thinking about the past year. So think about the past year. Thinking about the past year, when a potential or current employee was evaluated, in what percentage of the cases was the evaluation too negative or too positive due to factors not relevant to their job competency or organizational fit? So I want you to think about the answer, what kind of answer you'll give. What percentage of the cases was the evaluation too positive or too negative, based on not things that are relevant to their job competency or organizational fit? What answer would you give? Just think about this for 10 seconds. All right, so how many of you have an answer that's higher than 20%? Raise your hand. Okay. And higher than 40%? Raise your hand. Yeah, some number of people. So those are some examples. You probably don't want this to be higher than 10%, where the answer deviates from one to the other. So that's something for you to be thinking about. Now, looking at number 2, of all times when someone had to evaluate themselves, this is not others, in what percentage of the situations did they overestimate their positive qualities and underestimate their negative qualities? So what answer would you give to them? So they evaluated themselves, they overestimated their positive qualities, underestimated their negative qualities. So at least someone on your team, someone who you know their evaluation. Okay, I'll do it the other way around. How many have this at under 20%? Raise your hand. Don't really see anyone raising their hands. Okay, so this clearly is more of a broader issue. Good to know, so kind of self-evaluation. So the first one, of course, is about the halo effect and the horns effect. The second one is about egocentric bias. So that's a cognitive bias where we tend to have too positive evaluation of ourselves and we tend to think too well about ourselves compared to others. Next, percent of team conflicts that occurred because someone in the conflict overestimated the effectiveness of their communication skills and persuasiveness. So take 10 seconds and think about team conflicts that occurred over the past year. In what percentage of those conflicts did they occur because someone on the team overestimated the effectiveness of their communication and how persuasive they were? So take 10 seconds to do so. So who has this under 20%? Raise your hand. Something like 1 or 2 people. So this is an issue called the illusion of transparency. So the illusion of transparency is when we tend to perceive our communication as being more effective than it is. It's an illusion that our minds are transparent to others. Now in reality, when we think about our communication, other people might mishear us, or if you're having a virtual meeting, there might be technology issues. Or they might have different interpretations of words. For example, what does a few mean? What does several mean? What does a couple mean? Different people have different interpretations of these. Or what does a likelihood mean? This is likely to happen. Is that 90% or is that 60%? Right? So those are things to think about. So we can misinterpret words, or we can hear the words correctly, we can just disagree with the other person without them knowing that we're disagreeing with them, because we don't want to fight, we don't want a conflict. So the other person might perceive that we are agreeing with them, but in reality, we might just not want to have this discussion right now, and we just move on with our day. And the disagreement is under there brewing. So those are some examples of cognitive biases that you can get at through using this assessment. And so taking a look at the assessment, you can get at what specifically are the biggest challenges. And again, there are going to be 27 more questions like this. You'll get at what are the specific challenges for your team in evaluating other people. So within the broader category of unconscious bias, what are the specific cognitive biases? What are the specific ways that our brain is miswired? So that's what you'll get as a result of taking the assessment and having others take it. Now, let's talk about the 5 key questions to address decision disasters when we make those judgments about others. Everyone should have received a handout with the 5 key questions. So if you take that out, you'll be able to see 5 key questions, and you can fold, this is a tent card, you can fold it over, you can place it in front of you on your work table, wherever you work. And this is going to be very helpful for you in making decisions around other people. So let's say you're writing an email, you can take a glance at those 5 key questions. You're about to talk to someone, you can take a glance at that. You can do it for major decisions like hiring, promotion, you can take a look for minor decisions, like again, writing an email that might be perceived in some way as tense or negative or conflictual, and everything in between. Now, this is also good for making team decisions. So again, if you're looking at hiring someone, you can use these 5 key questions to have a team decision-making discussion as well. Let's take a look at the questions. First, what important information did I not yet fully consider? So what evidence didn't I take into account? There are going to be 2 important components of this. You tend to not consider information that goes against your intuition, that goes against your beliefs. So look for information that goes against your intuition, that goes against your beliefs, and weigh that information much more heavily than you would otherwise. Also, consider what information is important. So you don't want to fall into analysis paralysis and look at the information that's not important. It's valuable for you to decide in advance what information you'll consider important, whether you're hiring someone, whether you're writing an email about a project deadline that's missed or whatever it might be. What information is actually important? Next, what cognitive biases, dangerous judgment errors haven't I yet fully considered? If it's a decision about another person, might be the halo effect, might be the horns effect. If it's something about how you communicate to others, it might be the illusion of transparency. So all of these things, obviously, if you're an optimist, the other person is a pessimist, you might want to consider that. Next, what would a trusted and objective advisor suggest I do? So think about that angel on your shoulder. What would that person who you trust, who is an objective, trusted advisor, suggest you do? And get most of the benefits for this question just by thinking about this and trying to really place yourself in a trusted, objective advisor role. And of course, you get the rest of the benefit by calling this person, or if you're younger than 30, texting the person. Now, moving on from making the decision to implementing it. Because if you make the decision that's correct, but you don't implement it well, you still will not achieve the outcome that you want. So, 4, how have I addressed all the ways this could fail? Thinking about failure. think in advance, imagine that the decision failed, and think about all the reasons for why it failed. Imagine that it's been 3 months, and you look back and you say, okay, that was just screwed up, it failed. Why did it fail? What are all the problems that caused it to fail? And try to address these problems in advance. And finally, what would cause you to change your mind? What would cause you to shift your perspective? Now, the problem with decision making is that after we make a decision, we tend to be stuck with that decision. We tend to not want to change our minds. We tend to be anchored. It's much more effective to decide in advance that, hey, these new facts will cause me to change my mind. And that will make it much more likely that you'll change your mind. So let's take a look at how you would apply this to a major decision like hiring. So if you're hiring someone, how will this work? So what new information have you not had fully considered? I tend to find that many companies don't consider references nearly sufficiently. Many companies think, well, okay, this person has 3 references. I'm sure they'll just give puffy, flaky information if I call them, so I'm not going to call the references. But in reality, there are lots of ways of asking questions from references that get you the information you need. For example, you can ask, what kind of a culture would this person be a great fit for? And that's a question that someone is not going to be able to fake because they don't know your culture. And so that's a way of asking the question. Or you can see, who is this person connected to on LinkedIn, and then ask their connections on LinkedIn who you're connected to, if they have any opinions about this person. So you can get references from other sources. That's another way to think about this. Second, what are the cognitive biases that you might not have considered? So thinking about their backgrounds. You remember that wheel that we talked about in the pause and reflect slide. What aspects of these ethnicity, background, accent, region, from where they come from, everything, sexuality, ability, might be different from you, but cause you to perceive them in too negative a way, or what can be similar to you? Did you go to the same university or something like that? Are you both rooting for the Phoenix Suns, that cause you to perceive them in too positive a way? Moving on to what would a trusted and objective advisor suggest I do? So you want to run the interview questions that you asked and your descriptions of the candidates by somebody who is a neutral third party who can give you feedback on these questions. Next, what about implementing it? Say you're making the decision, how can you address all the ways this could fail? So one way to make sure that the person who is recently hired doesn't fail is to provide them with good mentoring. And that means having at least 2 mentors, one who is on their team and one who is not, because the person who's on their team will help them connect to people who are on the same team, help them build their team culture and learn what the team culture is about, the different dynamics and relationships with the team. The person who's outside the team can help them build a wider network within the company and help them learn about all the ways that their career can progress, all the people that they need to know, and have them have that good mentorship. And finally, what would cause you to change your mind about this person? A really good way of addressing this is to have evaluations, 360-degree evaluations at the 1 month, 2 month, and 3 month mark. The 1 month mark speak to the person, 5 people this person interacts with most, and you can give feedback to this person because they can still improve. And you can do that at the 2 month mark, and at the 3 month mark, you can make a final decision about this person. So that's a way of applying this to a really important decision, hiring someone. And of course, there are ways of applying this to the less important decisions that are still good, you don't want to screw up. Now, I want you to take 10 seconds and think about how you can apply these questions to your daily decision making, to decisions that you don't want to screw up, especially since you have a decision aid with you. So take 10 seconds and do that. Think about how you will be applying this. Think about which of the questions might be most powerful for you to ask. All right, so 2 more slides. Let's talk about the key takeaways that I want you to take away, that you should be thinking about as we're coming out of this conversation. One is, don't just go with your gut. Again, our intuitions, our tendencies are shaped by the ancestral savanna, the fight or flight response, tribalism. Those are ways that we make mistakes. And from a scientific background, is just something that's part of human nature. So our gut reaction causes us to make bad decisions. You could see this in, let's say, our food intake. We tend to have too much of a predisposition to eat sweet food, because in the savanna environment, it was very important for us when we came across sugar, honey, bananas, whatever it is, to have as much of it as possible. So now in the modern world, we tend to be triggered by sugar and have too much of it. There's a reason there's an obesity epidemic in this country. And so when you wanted to think about this, you've probably done something yourself to try to avoid or control this tendency to be triggered by sugar. Whether you go to the gym, you do exercises, you have intermittent fasting, I do intermittent fasting. So whatever you do, you take care of your physical fitness. In the same way, you need to take care of your mental fitness by not just going with your gut. So really thinking about your mental fitness is the key here. Next, watch out for these dangerous judgment errors. The way that you take care of your mental fitness to make good decisions is to learn about these cognitive biases and care about them so that you're emotionally motivated to address them because you don't want to make bad decisions about other people. And integrate the strategies to address these problems, to make it part of your daily activities for yourself and for your team. So integrate those strategies that I talked about. The 5 key questions, taking the assessment, discussing the results of the assessment, and seeing, okay, what are the most problematic aspects of what we do and how can we address them? All right. And so as you think about going forward, I really encourage you to invest into addressing unconscious bias through emotional and social intelligence. So the benefits for you and your team is that you'll uplift diversity, equity, and inclusion. You'll promote effective teamwork and collaboration. You'll minimize decision disasters and maximize success in evaluating other people. So what's your story? What kind of leader are you? And what will you do to address unconscious bias? Thank you very much.